Hello there. I've been expecting you. I've just been catching up on this wonderful novel, The War of the Worlds. Have you heard of it? Well, in this day and age, you're far more likely to be familiar with the 2005 movie starring Tom Cruise. It's a perfectly passable film, a bit too loud for my taste, and like H.G. Wells' novel, it tells the story of an alien invasion in the process of destroying the world as we know it. Of course, the film does not faithfully replicate the plots of Wells' classic. Characters are added and story beats are changed in order to better suit the medium of film. You see, every medium that delivers art also brings with it a set of aesthetics, strengths, and weaknesses, and when you take a story designed to be read on the page and try to translate it to the medium such as film, there are certain elements of the story that will not be as impactful as they were in the original. A failure to properly adapt media to a new format can have dire consequences. For example, in 1938, listeners across America tuned into a radio broadcast of a dramatization of War of the Worlds. This broadcast was adapted to seem like realistic news reports of an alien invasion, and unfortunately, the dramatization was so effective that listeners who were unfamiliar with Wells's tale were terrified of what they thought was a genuine invasion by an alien race. A similar broadcast was made by an Ecuadorian radio station in 1949, which resulted in a mass panic that caused 5 people to lose their lives. While the consequences of poor adaptation are rarely as disastrous as the War of the Worlds radio show, this should highlight the necessity to be as diligent and careful as possible when translating a work of art. Of course, we're not here to talk about the War of the Worlds. If you looked at your invitation and the title of the video, you will know that we're here to discuss several of the many adapted versions of Lewis Carroll's classic tale, Alice in Wonderland. Chances are you're already familiar with Carroll's story. A young girl named Alice falls into a dreamland filled with fantastical talking creatures. She struggles with the existential philosophy of Wonderland as she tries desperately to find her way home. Originally published in 1865, Alice in Wonderland has enjoyed over 150 years of celebrated popularity, with hundreds of representations spread across every medium available. But before we begin to dissect her counterparts, we must get to know Alice as she was known by her author, Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll, whose real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, was a mathematician, logician, clergyman, and photographer who lived at Oxford College, where he often gave lectures. Reverend Dodgson was obsessed with all things logical, loving riddles, games, and mathematics with an equal passion. He invented many games for the enjoyment of the children he spent much of his time with. He also meticulously recorded all of his written correspondences, amassing a catalog of over 798,000 letters sent and received. He also kept a journal where he detailed his goings-on day to day. Lewis Carroll was not Dodgson's only alias. Among others he used are Dares, Balbus, and my personal favorite, Madmathesis. Dodgson created the name Lewis Carroll by converting his name into Latin, getting Carolus Ludovicus, and then back into English for Lewis Carroll. Dodgson was very fond of implanting references into his writing, even when he thought that no one would be able to decipher their meaning. As well as including his real name within his pen name, he also based many of his Wonderland characters on real people living and working around Oxford College at the time. Dodgson himself is represented in the character of the dodo bird, because Dodgson suffered from a stutter and was known to introduce himself as Dodgson. Other references include the White Rabbit, who many at Oxford could have guessed was the resident physician Dr. Henry Ackland. Of course, none of his characters' real-life counterparts are as obvious as the titular Alice, who Dodgson based off of a real little girl he knew, the daughter of the Dean, Alice Liddell. Born in 1852, Alice Liddell was a young age of 10 when she embarked with her sisters, Lorena and Edith, on a boat ride down the River Isis with the Reverend Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. It was here, according to Dodgson's journal, that he originally spun the tale of Alice's adventures down the rabbit hole to those 3 eager listeners. Unlike the many stories undoubtedly told to them by Dodgson before, This one was so special to the young Alice Liddell that she begged Charles to write it down, which he began to do almost immediately. It would be another 13 years before the novel was published, and the story of Alice and her ventures underground would be absorbed by thousands. Dodgson's story told the tale of an average young girl living a privileged life in rural England in the mid-1800s. Bored with her lessons, the adventurous Alice decides to chase after a mysterious white rabbit, following it down a rabbit hole and into a wonderless underground world. In many ways, this story mimics the common myth of a young virgin who explores the underworld and returns to the world of the living, most familiar to Westerners as the story of Persephone, though it is an archetype common among many mythologies. This is important to understanding Dodgson's Alice, as Wonderland is both a magical place and a terrifying one for poor Alice. Alice is constantly crying and struggling to make sense of the strange place that she finds herself in, and very few of the beings she meets on her travels are friendly. After crying enough tears to fill a small pool and changing size many times, Alice meets the caterpillar, a very rude character who interrogates Alice before finally providing some helpful advice. After meeting the curmudgeon caterpillar, Alice then meets a very unpleasant duchess and her smiling pet, the Cheshire Cat. A very popular character, the Cheshire Cat is one of very few creatures that is helpful to Alice without being impolite. The Cheshire Cat directs Alice to her next destination, the March Hare's hut, where the Hare and the Hatter are having a mad tea party. Tired of the inscrutable logic of Wonderland, Alice's visit to the tea party is a frustrating one, made no better by the impertinence of her hosts, the Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse. After a short while of trying to solve riddles without answers, Alice leaves in a huff and quickly discovers the entrance to the royal grounds, where the Queen of Hearts is playing croquet. Now, if you're a fan of some of the adapted versions of Alice in Wonderland, you may be thinking that I have left some characters off, but many popular characters such as Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the White Queen, and the Humpty Dumpty are actually from Dodgson's second installment of Alice's adventures through the Looking Glass. This sequel also contains the character of the Red Queen, who is commonly confused with the Queen of Hearts, though they are two distinct characters. The Red Queen is a chess piece who acts as a teacher to Alice, while the Queen of Hearts is a playing card and a tyrant. Anyways, after joining the Queen's croquet game and saving several people from execution, Alice is soon summoned to the court to be a juror in the trial of the Knave of Hearts versus the Queen. After becoming fed up with the nonsense laws of Wonderland, and once again becoming much larger than the court, Alice speaks her mind and upsets the court, ending her dream and waking up next to her sister. Now that we're familiar with Charles, Alice, and their fantastic tale, let's take a look at some of the many adapted versions of Alice in Wonderland. The first piece of media we will cover is arguably the most popular, the 1951 Disney animated production of Alice in Wonderland. This movie portrays the story of Alice through a series of psychedelic scenes and operatic orchestral themes. Much like the original literary work, this version of Alice in Wonderland has very little in the way of plot. Alice falls through the rabbit hole and into a technicolor dream world filled with characters from her imagination. This movie does a fantastic job of pulling Dodgson's themes and characters into an animated realm, though it does draw heavily from Dodgson's other work, Alice Through the Looking Glass. Characters like Tweedledee and Tweedledum and the Talking Flowers have been pulled from the mirror and placed into Wonderland, making the movie feel like someone took all of Dodgson's ideas and put them on shuffle. I find this to be a somewhat strange choice. The inclusion of the external characters can't have been done for time, as there are an equal many characters who belong in Wonderland that could have filled that purpose. Not to mention there's also a 5-minute sequence where Alice is lost all by herself. I'm no animator, but my assumption is that the people working on this film had little idea of how to creatively represent characters like the Angry Duchess in a manner that fit their whimsical art style. This decision proved to be an excellent idea, however, as the movie is still celebrated for its colorful animation that heavily inspired the aesthetic of the psychedelic counterculture that hit America shortly after Alice in Wonderland hit theaters. Overall, this version of Alice in Wonderland is much more friendly than Dodgson's, and makes for a great introduction to Alice for children who may be too young to read the stuffy Victorian English of a children's novel published in 1865. The next adaptation we will discuss is the 2010 Tim Burton movie, Alice in Wonderland. This version tells the story of an aged-up Alice, now a young adult, and her struggles against systematic norms, portrayed through her unwillingness to marry her suitor, the rich but unattractive Lord Hamish. In my opinion, this movie perfectly hits the mark from a visual standpoint. The bizarre aesthetic that Tim Burton brings to all of his projects is a perfect match for Alice, and I think they did a wonderful job bringing Wonderland to life. When it comes to the content of the movie, however, I do have my complaints. Among my more minor nitpicks are the constant mishmash of characters. Tweedledee and Tweedledum are one thing, but mixing of adaption stories becomes more noticeable when the chess piece White Queen and the Queen of Hearts pack of cards meet for battle on a giant chessboard. A more concerning problem, and a more blatant one, is this movie's obvious desire to imitate The Lord of the Rings. Throughout the entire movie, characters are given secondary fantasy names, locations are given detailed maps, and action and bloodshed are everywhere. The playing cards that Alice was originally able to stand up to as a 10-year-old are now taller than her and decked out in full armor. In my opinion, the violence of Wonderland and the insistence that Alice is in real danger undermines the power that Alice holds over her reality. As much as Alice struggles to overcome the strict rules present in her normal life, Wonderland Alice is constantly told that if she does not obey the prophecy, and yes, of course there is a prophecy, that she will die along with all of Wonderland's fantastic denizens. This makes the messaging of the movie feel confused, as Alice spends all her time in Wonderland learning the value in following predetermined destinies, only to turn around and shrug off her real-world responsibilities. As I said before, the violence, knights and dragons, and unnecessary level of world-building make this movie feel all too much like a ripoff of Lord of the Rings, which is a real shame. There is so much whimsy and childishness to be found in Wonderland that to add in the gritty realism of an adult fantasy genre, I think really misses the mark. And to be honest, if they wanted to rip off a beloved fantasy movie, they should have just ripped off The Wizard of Oz. Overall, though, this movie does a good job of translating Alice in Wonderland to the screen for a slightly more adult, maybe Hot Topic-loving audience. Also, at the end of the movie, Alice becomes a colonizer working for the Disney version of the East India Tea Company. 0 out of 10, this movie sucks. The final story we will examine, before taking a look at some of Alice in Wonderland's more famous characters, is the video game American McGee's Alice. The slightly more adult themes of Tim Burton's Alice are nothing compared to the blood-filled nightmare that is American McGee's Alice. Developed by Rogue Entertainment and released in 2000, American McGee's Alice certainly earned its mature rating. The plot follows Alice Liddell, once again a young adult, trapped in an extreme psychosis triggered by PTSD and survivor's guilt. In this version, Alice's house burns down shortly after the events of Through the Looking Glass, killing her entire family and leaving Alice the sole survivor. Severely damaged by this event, Alice goes on to live in an asylum, where she is once again called to Wonderland, now twisted by her damaged psyche. Alice is then sent on a quest to kill the Queen of Hearts, and it is implied that if she is able to bring peace to this dark version of Wonderland, that she will be able to cure the insanity that plagues her waking life. Much of this story involves fetch quests, where a character agrees to help you if only you will perform a dangerous task to acquire some item that they happen to need. This may seem like a somewhat weak plot, but for a video game, it is fairly solid. You see, in video games, the player is expected to take a large part in the action, creating their own fun through interaction. For this reason, the plots of many video games can seem weak when spelled out on paper. This is also the reason why so many movies made from adapted video games turn out so poorly. A plot structure and story may be amazing to experience when you are the character in the story capable of your own agency, but very boring to watch in the theater. For this reason, I think American McGee's Alice is the most successful adaptation on this list. Unlike the previous examples, this game is not overly concerned with maintaining a faithful recreation of Dodgson's story, instead opting to tell a new story that uses Alice as the aesthetic base, while injecting completely new ideas and themes that they are able to carry throughout the experience. Now that we have a general overview of the various adaptations that we're discussing, let's round this video out with a quick look at some of the characters found in Wonderland. As I mentioned before, Dodgson loved to include the real-life figures around his home of Oxford as characters within his novels. And if you'll recall, the White Rabbit is based off of Oxford's resident physician, Dr. Henry Ackland. Dr. Ackland would have been well known to Alice as he was the one to treat her whenever she fell ill, and the motif of the rabbit's lateness was also a real-life quality of Dr. Ackland, as he had his pocket watch set to Oxford time and was therefore constantly late to meetings that were scheduled with the newfangled Greenwich Mean Time. The White Rabbit is primarily famous for his role in enticing Alice into Wonderland in the first place, instigating her adventure, but he also appears at the end of the novel, serving as herald to the King and Queen of Hearts. The White Rabbit in Disney's animated classic is drawn very closely to the rabbit of Dodgson's original, being a nervous and untimely creature. He is a bit more timid than the original rabbit, and he is frequently shown to be taken advantage of by the other residents of Wonderland. Tim Burton's White Rabbit is a generally faithful recreation. With few speaking lines, he is both Alice's guide into Wonderland and the Queen of Hearts' unwilling herald. What more could you ask for? American McGee's version of the White Rabbit is also a minor helper for Alice, though he has no chance to appear in the Queen's court as he is murdered by the Mad Hatter. The real-life inspiration for Dodgson's caterpillar was Thomas de Quincey, author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, whose writing Dodgson was intimately familiar with. While the popular narrative today insists upon psychedelic mushrooms being an influence on Dodgson, if any drug was involved in Wonderland's creation, which is highly unlikely, opium is a much more believable candidate. In any case, Dodgson was at least familiar with the intoxicating effects of opium through De Quincey's writing, even if he had never experienced it himself. In the novel, Caterpillar is quite rude to Alice, though he does offer some sage advice, as well as a practical way for her to grow to her original size. The animated Caterpillar takes on a slightly amplified personality to the original, losing his temper frequently. The colorful depiction of his hookah lesson, probably combined with the ignorance of Americans not knowing what a hookah was, is what I believe to be the main reason that so many people attribute the bizarre nature of Wonderland to psychedelic inspiration. I myself believe that the creators of Disney's animated Alice must have been experimenting with LSD, but as the movie came out in 1951 and LSD wasn't popularized until the 60s, this is very unlikely, if not impossible, unless Walt was given acid by the CIA, as they were the main source at the time. In Tim Burton's version, the caterpillar, voiced by Alan Rickman, plays much the same role as the original caterpillar, though he does get much more screen time than the lepidopteran of literature. This caterpillar has some of the bite removed from his dialogue, making him much more of a father figure to Alice, rather than the strict instructor he originally embodied. The caterpillar in American McGee's Alice once again plays a similar role, mainly serving as a source of exposition. The caterpillar is the one to inform Alice of the connection between Wonderland's disastrous state and Alice's own madness. The inspiration for Dodgson's Cheshire Cat lies not in an individual, at least not one clear enough to make note, but rather in a nerdy, mathematics-based riddle. What kind of a cat can grin? With the answer being a catenary, which is the name of a curved line formed by a dangling chain. See, I told you it was nerdy. In the original novel, the Cheshire Cat is one of the very few characters who is kind to Alice and offers real advice. In the 1951 animated version, the Cheshire Cat is given much the same role, as well as role of comic relief. The animated cat is a bit more rambunctious than his literary counterpart, causing the Queen of Hearts to lose her temper. The Cheshire Cat in Tim Burton's adaptation is completely insufferable. The voice acting, the dialogue, and the art direction of Tim Burton's Cheshire Cat give off an air of condescension that persists throughout the movie, unhelped by the insistence of the script that the Cheshire Cat take a leading role in the drama. American McGee's Cheshire Cat is as creepy and unsettling as the rest of the game is, In the game, he is your closest ally, giving instruction and helpful hints as you progress throughout the story. The inspiration for Dodgson's Mad Hatter came from Cambridge College's Charles Kingsley, a prominent member of the Christian Socialist movement, which Dodgson, a staunch conservative, was highly opposed to. Dodgson was all too happy to portray the socialist as a raving lunatic. The decision to make the character a hatter comes from the plight of real-life hatters, whose use of mercury in their hat-making process often led them to a kind of madness known as Mad Hatter syndrome. Within the text, the Mad Hatter and his friends are quite mean to Alice, offering nothing in the way of refreshment and rudely commenting on her appearance and intelligence, causing Alice to leave in a huff. The Disney animated version of the Mad Hatter offers a much softer interpretation of his character. No longer impolite, the animated Hatter seems to genuinely want to help others, though his madness causes his attempts to end in failure. Tim Burton's Mad Hatter, played by Johnny Depp, is a much more complicated character. In this version, Hatter plays a larger role as Alice's best friend and closest ally, though some of his darker tendencies are seen during his frequent mental breaks. The Mad Hatter featured in American McGee's Alice takes a wildly different approach, making the Mad Hatter a secondary villain who murders the White Rabbit before being killed by Alice later on. Dodgson had no qualms in slandering real-life figures through his representations of them in his works. This is most obvious with the character of the Queen of Hearts, whom Dodgson based off of Alice Liddell's mother, Lorena Hannah Liddell. In order to understand why Dodgson represented Alice's mother as an angry, incorrigible tyrant, we must take a slightly darker turn in our recount of the history of Charles Dodgson. If you are familiar with some of the more popular myths surrounding Alice in Wonderland, you might be familiar with the elephant in the room, Charles Dodgson's close companionship with a 10-year-old girl with whom he had no familiar relationship. Indeed, Dodgson bore a fondness for children that was not unnoticed by his contemporaries, though his fraternization with prepubescent girls was not seen as particularly strange for the time period. Evidence for Dodgson having made untoward advances, or even worse, molestation, are completely absent in historical record, and an examination of Dodgson's own diary leads one to believe that he may have been something close to asexual, though he of course would not have used this label as an 18th century Englishman. And ascribing modern sexuality labels to historical figures can get murky quickly. What we do know is that shortly after a boat trip on June 25, 1863, Dodgson chaperoned the Liddell sisters home by himself. A few days later, Dodgson requested that the girls be sent to him to be photographed, as had been done many times before, but the girls never came. Instead, he was summoned to the deanery, where the Liddells made it clear to Dodgson that he should remain far away from their children. There was no argument for Dodgson, who believed that Miss Liddell had already made up her mind before he had arrived. While there was no evidence that Dodgson had physically molested the girls, Miss Liddell certainly sensed that something was wrong in their relationship. It is possible that Dodgson had made a proposal to marry Alice when she came of age, a proposition which would not have been looked down on because of the age gap, but rather because of societal status. The aristocrat Alice would have been far out of Dodgson's league in this sense. A more likely theory posits that the Liddells were not actually concerned with the young Alice, but rather her older sister Lorena, named after her mother, who had just recently come of age. While the adult Dodgson chaperoning a group of prepubescent girls was not particularly strange to the Victorian sensibilities of the time, Lorena's coming of age made Dodgson's closeness with her that much more scandalous, and several people around Oxford secretly believed that he was courting her. Whatever Dodgson's transgression, it is clear that Alice's mother strongly opposed the friendship between her daughters and Charles Dodgson. After that fateful meeting, Dodgson would hardly see Alice again, save for brief glances and chance meetings around Oxford. Although, when Alice's Adventures Underground was eventually published, he still dedicated the book to her and sent her an original hand-bound copy. Every variation and adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that I have seen, including those versions we spoke about today, have used the tyrannical version of the Queen of Hearts that Dodgson posed in his original story. Without the benefit of the knowledge of Dodgson's cruel characterization, this is clearly an innocent reproduction of the classic children's character. However, now that I know the true story of the Queen of Hearts, I can't help but feel bad for her, and especially for her real-world counterpart, Lorena Liddell. Her actions towards Dodgson were done to protect her family, and she was repaid with the libelous representation that has persisted through pop culture for 150 years. With all this information in mind, it's time to finally tackle the question: who is Alice? In her young adult life, Alice and her sisters became very popular models, being photographed by many of England's most prominent photographers at the time. When Alice turned 18, her mother once again brought her to Dodgson's studio, where he would take his final portrait of Alice, which the elder Lorena intended to show to Alice's potential suitors. Alice would need no help in that regard, as in 1876 she met Reginald Jervis Hargreaves, a first-class cricket player as well as Alice's eventual husband. Alice and Reginald were married on September 15, 1880, when Alice was 28 years old. Dodgson was not invited to the wedding. Alice would spend many of the following years hosting parties and enjoying the lavish life of the British upper class, until World War I took 2 of her 3 sons and bankrupted the Hargreave estate. Reginald Hargreave would die a short while later in 1926, leaving the widowed Alice to care for the estate herself, as her only remaining son, Carol, was very poor at financial management. The state of the Hargreaves' finances had become so dire that Alice was forced to auction off the original copy of Alice's Adventures Underground that Dodgson had given her, for the handsome sum of £15,000, a boon that should have kept their estate afloat for the remainder of Alice's life, but was instead squandered by her son Carol. Still, Alice was not quite finished living the high life, as her status as one of literature's most influential muses kept her busy with seemingly endless interviews and appearances. After leading a long life of intrigue and inspiration, Alice died at the age of 82 on November 16, 1934. What I hope this vignette provides is something that Charles Dodgson saw clearly, and is a fact that nearly all the representation of Alice's character seemed to miss. That is, that Alice is an ordinary girl. The curiosity, the discomfort with societal norms, and the madness of imagination do not make Alice unique among children. The story of Alice in Wonderland could be told about any child, and the true magic of the tale is the nostalgic experience of a youthful mind curiously exploring a mysterious world of rules and randomness. Sources for this video include, of course, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, the revised edition. This one's by Richard Kelly. And Alice's Adventures in Wonderland Decoded. This one's by David Day, and this was incredibly important. A lot of the information about Charles's life, and mostly the inspiration for some of his characters in Alice in Wonderland, came from this book. I highly recommend it. It's a really great read, and there's some great art in here too. There's Dodgson. Thank you for watching this video. It's my first one. It took a long time to make. This is way harder than it looks. I have a newfound respect for all of the video essayists I watch because this was hard to do. And it's still not as good as I would like to be. But once again, thank you for watching. Sorry to my professor for taking literally every single possible second I could have to make this and submit it within the last, just under the wire. So yeah, sorry about that. But thanks for being a cool professor. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
And I thank you, and everyone, all for the kind reception you have given both to that and to me. Thank you again and again.